Perhaps you have been paying close attention to Ukraine's remarkable mission to destroy every Russian oil refinery that it can reach. But are you aware that Ukraine recently started a second campaign? Similar in flavor, yet with a distinct target, and one that raises some fascinating questions about just how vulnerable Russia is? That is why today we need to discuss the surprising success of Ukrainian airstrikes, why it seems that the problems will only continue for Russia, and how the Western coalition can make Russia's problems even worse. Let's start with the central puzzle that will drive the bulk of today's analysis. The main campaign dates back to August, and mostly focuses on oil refineries. Facilities like this one that take crude oil as an input and output products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. The newer campaign did not start for more than a month, and did not really get serious until October. It targets Russian power plants and the corresponding electrical grid. It is easy to treat these two campaigns as having identical strategies, because they both use the same aerial weapons. However, some subtle differences tell us a bunch about the situation on the ground for Russia. The story of the Kremlin's troubles traces back to the oil and gas infrastructure part. I should note that some of these strikes specifically targeted gas pipelines that went to Europe. However, as far as we can tell, Ukraine has moved away from those targets recently. It may be that Ukraine learned that they were just not as effective at causing long-term damage. It may also be that they do not make as many headlines because they do not explode quite as much, and so they are indeed still happening, but we just do not see them. Either way, we definitely know that the refinery strikes are continuing and expanding. And while I know that I have commented on both the continuation and expansion parts of this campaign for months now, the longer that this goes, the deeper we need to think about the consequences. Indeed, there are both critical economic implications and interesting strategic questions that the campaign raises. Let's do the economics first. Keep in mind that these refineries are meant to serve the domestic Russian market. Thus, domestically, the campaign's purpose is to lead to fuel shortages, upset populations, and protests on the streets of Moscow. Internationally, the campaign was not meant to have a direct effect on the broader fuel market, beyond Russia doing something very out of character and having to meet supply by importing gasoline. There was even some speculation that the attacks would lead to an increase in the global exchange's crude supply. The idea here is that Russian refineries would stop purchasing as much crude because they simply are not running as often as usual. The lingering question was what Russia could do with the surplus in crude. Under normal times, the answer would be to just sell it to one of Russia's willing partners. But we do not live in normal times, now do we? The trouble is that you actually have to physically deliver the oil to those countries. And it was unclear whether Russia had the spare oil tanker capacity to do so, given that it is running a shadow fleet and cannot simply tap the open market to call for more ships. Well, it appears that the answer is that some spare capacity existed. There is evidence that Russia's crude oil exports ticked up a small percentage in September, which was the second full month of Ukraine's refinery campaign. As it stood, the attacks created an interesting trade-off for Russia. There would be greater domestic instability for Russia due to the local fuel shortages, but more money coming in from exports. Now, we know that such an arrangement is unfavorable for the Kremlin. If obtaining greater import revenues were the overall wise thing to do, it could have just done that before Ukraine left it with no other option. But the Kremlin did not, because it needs some level of domestic order to stay in power. However, the surplus crude exports still leave the Western coalition the task of how to reduce Russia's ruble revenues. The straightforward solution is to sanction the silly stuff. To that, Trump tried to tariff India to trim their take. But as we discussed months ago when that started, the low-level sanction that Trump implemented would not be enough to push India off the Russian drip. Where there has been more success is with the recent sanctions against the financial arms of Russia's oil sector. Yes, it took a while for the Trump administration to finally implement them, but they are working. The sanctions have increased the bureaucratic process that companies in India, China, or elsewhere must go through, increasing the discount that Russia must offer, and thus overall cutting into the Kremlin's profits. The second strategy that Ukraine has just put greater emphasis on is to target the Russian export terminals. The crude leaving the country actually has to leave the country. If you bomb the terminals where that normally happens, which is what Ukraine is doing, the crude will just start to pile up in Russia. Mostly this happens along the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. The Black Sea, of course, is easier to bomb to oblivion because it is nearby. That leaves the Baltic, and the next major step that Europe could take. There is a choke point here, the Danish Straits, which connect the Baltic to the North Sea, and thus the rest of the world. If Europe really wanted to, it could stop all of the Russian oil shipments passing through there. The one slight problem with this strategy is that blockades run counter to freedom of navigation principles and are generally considered acts of war. As a result, Europe would need to get creative in how it would implement what would, definitely not be a blockade. There is a legitimate pathway here that does not simply try to legalese its way out of specifically singling out Russia. Any ship that passes through the straits is a legal liability to other ships and the infrastructure nearby. Case in point, those undersea cables that dragged anchors have accidentally destroyed. The standard way to solve the problem is to require all ships to carry insurance. Basically, the same solution that is mandated for drivers on the road. So, you institute a rule that all ships passing through the straits have insurance. Any ships that are suspected of not having insurance may be stopped and asked for proof of that insurance. This strategy works because one of the first sanctions imposed against Russia was to forbid Russian ships from purchasing insurance on Western markets, which just so happened to collectively hold something close to a monopoly. Russia resolved that problem by the government creating its own insurance scheme. Europe could therefore rule that it does not trust Russian insurance, and therefore forbid any ship from passing through without, say, a huge amount of money in escrow. Now, when I hear legally minded folks suggesting this solution, it often comes with a certain self-satisfaction with finding a loophole to solve the conundrum. However, let me be clear. This is putting lipstick on a pig. It is still a pig. The Kremlin is not going to find this legal trickery to be compelling. And if you are not sure about that, ask yourself, when was the last time an international law stopped Russia from doing something? Clever or not, at the end of the day, the scheme is still a de facto blockade of Russian ships. As such, the real question is whether Europe thinks that instituting the insurance requirement will lead to serious escalation with Russia. If so, you can bet that European capitals will be reluctant to implement the policy. That is basically the same story as any other serious measure throughout the war. But if all it will do is inconvenience Russia to the point that the Kremlin orders the Shadow Fleet to trade at the price cap, thereby opening the Western insurance market to those tankers, then it is a win. Please keep in mind that this is not a Putin is done scenario, but Russia needs cash to pay for its recruits. If the flow of money stops, or at least slows down, Russia cannot throw humanity into the grinder to push the front as it currently is. These numbers are then liable to stall out. Let's now switch to the strategic military implications here. We are still left with the puzzle of how, after almost 4 months, Russia has yet to figure out how to solve this problem. And, oh yeah, Ukraine is doubling down without any repercussions. Actually, if all this video focused on was the switch to targeting the electrical grid, then you might suspect that Russia had internalized the threat to refineries and rearranged its air defenses to protect its sensitive assets. Ukraine, then recognizing the Russian adaptation, reoriented its strikes to hit the unprotected electrical grid. Such strikes would not be, and indeed are not, as valuable as hitting refineries, of course. The reason that Ukraine targeted refineries in the first place is because there is a ton of explosive potential just sitting on the ground. As such, if Ukraine could deliver even a small explosive to the facility, it would inflict serious damage. Power plants and the electrical grid, in contrast, do not explode as much and are easier to repair. Moreover, oftentimes electricity can be rerouted from elsewhere in the system, reducing the overall effect on the Russian economy. But that is not what has happened. Ukraine is keeping pace on the refinery front. It is adding a second campaign on top of what it was already doing. So, what gives? Well, we live in the fog of war, so do not expect a clear answer here. But let me offer some possibilities. Let's begin with the simplest explanation, which is also the least likely to be correct. Remember that back in August, the United States started supplying Ukraine with intelligence on how to avoid Russian air defenses. That appears to have convinced Kyiv that building and launching drones and missiles into Russia would be a good idea, and thus we got the refinery campaign. It is possible that Ukraine at first only calculated that refineries would be worth the investment, and so refineries were the only targets worth bombing. But then Kyiv saw the success on that front, realized that the probability of hitting a target was higher than it thought because US intelligence was so good, and then expanded its campaign to less valuable targets. You can see some evidence for this in how a large majority of the attacks are right over the border, as though Ukraine does not think it is worth having a missile or drone fly a great distance and risk getting shot down when the target is but a lowly electrical facility. Indeed, about half of the long-distance targets have hit Moscow's expansive grid, which you might calculate as politically important enough to be worth the exception. The reason that I would bet against this being the answer is that Ukraine waited more than 2 months to double down. Ukraine has shown little hesitation in exploring other opportunities in the past, so it would be weird if it took so long for Kyiv to experiment with the electrical grid. A second possibility is that Ukraine has expanded its strike production. This is almost certainly true on some level, especially given how flamingos have come into the picture. The more interesting aspect of surplus missiles is that it would imply that Russia has done a poor job of hitting Ukrainian production facilities, lest we forget that Russia is engaged in a similar air campaign. Perhaps some of that has to do with the air defenses that Ukraine has developed. Nonetheless, the most intriguing possibility is that Russia simply has fewer air defenses than it did at the start of this campaign. Again, the United States is supplying intelligence to Ukraine on how to avoid Russian air defenses. It therefore stands to reason that the United States might also be telling Ukraine exactly where the Russian air defenses are located. If Ukraine had limited strike packages, then it would make sense to avoid the defenses altogether. Why fight your way through fortifications when you could just go through the back door instead? However, let's imagine that you suddenly found yourself with an abundance of bombs. Then maybe you would want to switch to actively seeking out the air defenses. Sure, you will lose a large portion of your missiles and drones to those defenses. You are making their jobs super easy by going right at them. But the upshot for Ukraine is that doing so hedges against the possibility that one day the United States might pull support. In the meantime, it also reduces future failures in the main campaign whenever US intelligence is inaccurate. For the Western coalition, it directly degrades the types of defenses that Russia would need in case of a broader conflict. It also prevents Russia from sending air defenses to, say, Venezuela, despite suggestions to the contrary from a Russian lawmaker. Unfortunately, it is hard to draw a firm conclusion here, because we do not get the same quality of public feedback on air defense targeting as we do for the other types of strikes. We have very good data on Russian refinery strikes, because the explosions are massive, and ordinary Russians are oh so happy to give the West damage assessments by posting videos to Telegram. I am confident that this map is close to comprehensive, if not actually comprehensive. We have a decent idea of the electrical grid attacks because they somewhat explode, and also leave portions of Russia under blackout, though I am not as confident that this is the entire set of attacks on the electrical grid. In any case, getting good data on strikes to Russian air defenses is a pipe dream. The explosions are small, and the air defenses may be in the middle of nowhere. Of course, we get inconsistent reports on Ukraine destroying certain systems, but it is difficult to parse out whether this is happening on an ad hoc basis or is part of a grander but mostly unobserved strategy. Still, there is no philosophical question here. If an air defense unit is hit, but no one is there to post it to Telegram, is the air defense unit hit at all? It very much is, I assure you, because it will not be there tomorrow to defend against the next wave. And I would love nothing more than to be able to plot all of them on a map. Forget about lines. We are doing X's now. But we just do not know what is happening to the air defenses here. Meanwhile, you do know what is about to happen here. I am dropping some truth bombs in the form of 2 excellent books about the war. Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.